Before the bankers, before the credit ledgers, before America learned to count its worth in paper, there were men who built it with their hands. They came with shovels, not savings. They crossed oceans and mountains chasing a promise, not a paycheck. They bartered, they traded, they sweated. And in doing so, they created a kind of wealth no bank could ever store. It was a time when a man's word was worth more than gold because gold couldn't chop a tree or raise a roof. Today, we'll witness the forgotten story of the men who built America before money existed. The first sound was wind, not the cry of a nation, not yet, just the Atlantic wind sweeping through an untamed coast. In the spring of 1607, a group of Englishmen stepped ashore at a place they named Jamestown. They had little gold, less experience, and no understanding of the land before them. But they carried shovels, saws, and something harder to name, belief. They dug into Virginia clay like men trying to carve permanence out of uncertainty. Every swing of the shovel was a gamble, on survival, on soil, on each other. They built rough shelters from pine and oak, patched roofs with bark, and learned that the real wealth of this place was not found under the ground, but upon it. At night, the firelight flickered over faces hollowed by hunger. The company charters back in London had spoken of profit, of gold, silk, spices, but here profit came in the form of corn traded with the Powhatan, a barrel of clean water, or a sharp axe that didn't break in the cold. No coins changed hands. A man's worth was measured by what he could make, mend, or move. The carpenter who could raise a wall in a day ate first. The blacksmith who kept iron glowing became a lifeline. And the man who shirked, he found himself at the bottom of every ration list. By the time winter arrived, half were gone. The rest bartered everything that wasn't nailed down. A nail became a prize, a musket ball, a small fortune. They learned quickly that survival wasn't about possession, it was about exchange. If a man had nails and another had food, a trade was struck. If neither had anything but time, they traded labor, a day's work for a night's shelter. This was America's first economy. Work for work, skill for trust. No debt, no interest. Only the unspoken rule that a promise kept was worth more than a debt paid. A few miles inland, the settlers found a stretch of fertile ground and began to till it. The soil was dark, almost black, and it gave corn, tobacco, and beans to those who learned its rhythm. Here, the first gardens of America took root, not for profit, but for life. The men who worked those rows began to see something. Every seed planted was a small act of ownership, not in title, but in spirit. They were not rich men, but they were free in the oldest sense, free from banks, free from wages, free from anything that could not be built with their own hands. When new ships arrived months later, carrying refined goods and silver trinkets, the settlers barely looked up. They had learned a harsher truth, that comfort was not currency. Sweat, not silver, made this place stand. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the axes were set down, they sat by the river and spoke quietly of what they'd seen. Wolves in the trees, smoke on the horizon, and sometimes they spoke of what they'd left behind, the noise of cities, the counting houses, the ledgers. Here there were no ledgers, only ledges of rock, and men trying to build atop them. And slowly, a code began to form, one not written by kings or merchants, but by the frontier itself. Do your part, keep your word, earn your keep. It wasn't law, but it might as well have been scripture. And in that rough settlement on the James River, under tarred roofs and open sky, the first unwritten covenant of America took shape, a covenant between men and the work that defined them. By 1620, ships carrying new settlers arrived farther north, at a place they called Plymouth. The soil was harder there, the winters crueler, but the spirit was the same. They built, they bartered, they endured. Their harvest feasts weren't celebrations of wealth. They were acts of gratitude that they'd survived another year without owing a thing to anyone. Before Wall Street, before Washington, before America had a name, these men carved a life out of wilderness using nothing but tools, trust, and time. And as they raised their crude wooden homes against the wind, they didn't know it yet, but they were laying the foundation for something that would outlast them all. The smell of wood smoke and sweat drifted through the clearing. In the flicker of dawn light, two men shook hands over a deal. A musket repaired in exchange for 20 pounds of corn. No signatures, no parchment. Just a nod between men who understood the meaning of fairness. Across the early colonies, Virginia, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, the barter frontier became the heartbeat of daily life. There were no banks, no vaults, and scarcely a coin in circulation. What existed instead was a living web of trade, a quiet rhythm that bound farmer to blacksmith, trapper to tanner, family to family. Every transaction was personal, every promise a test of character. If you delivered poor goods, word spread fast. If you kept your bargains, neighbors trusted you with more. Reputation was more than pride. It was liquidity. It kept food on the table, roofs patched, and friendships alive through hard winters. A walk through a settlement market in 1640 would have sounded like this. I'll trade 2 cords of hickory for a bushel of rye. Throw in a new hinge and I'll mend your plow. Done. The currency of the colonies was sweat, skill, and barter goods. Tobacco leaves, beaver pelts, salted pork, candles, and nails. Each had a recognized value, not by decree, but by necessity. In Virginia, tobacco became so common a medium of exchange that debts were written in it. 40 pounds of good leaf could buy a musket or settle a dowry. In the North, where fur and timber ruled, men traded pelts for flour, iron pots, or even passage on ships. To outsiders, it looked crude. To the men living it, it was freedom, a system that owed nothing to London, no interest to a crown, no obedience to bankers. But this freedom came with a burden. Trust had to be absolute. A dishonest trader could starve a village. A lazy man could break a harvest. So each town began to grow its own invisible network of worth, one that measured not money but dependability. Every handshake was collateral. Every tool lent out was a small act of faith. And in time, these habits hardened into something larger, a moral economy. It wasn't written down anywhere, yet everyone knew its rules. Never short a neighbor. Never take more than you give. Work speaks louder than wealth. These rules built towns stronger than any walls. By mid-century, the barter frontier stretched from the Maine coast to the Carolina woods. Frontier posts, small log-built trading houses, dotted the wilderness. A trapper might arrive with a sled full of pelts, trade them for salt, shot, and linen, then vanish again into the forest. His word was his credit, his trade his lifeline. Outposts like Albany, St. Mary's, and Charlestown became crossroads of barter, where English goods met native skill. Beads, iron, and cloth flowed one way. Furs, corn, and hides flowed back. These exchanges weren't just economic, they were human. Both sides depended on the other to survive. And in that dependence, America found its first form of mutual respect, hard-won, imperfect, but real. There were dangers too. Barter left no paper trail, no authority to mediate disputes. When a man broke his word, there was no sheriff to sue, only the long memory of his neighbors. A single dishonest act could exile him from the community. In a world built on trust, disgrace was bankruptcy. And so honesty wasn't virtue, it was survival. Yet out of this crude system rose the first flickers of something distinctly American: self-reliance. A blacksmith didn't wait for permission to earn. A farmer didn't wait for approval to build. Each man became his own banker, his own craftsman, his own guarantee. In a world without money, everything had meaning, every nail hammered, every loaf baked, every favor returned. The land itself began to echo this rhythm. The rustle of trade, the ring of hammer on iron, the hush of understanding between men who didn't need contracts to make things right. As the 17th century wore on, the barter frontier matured. Communities learned to measure wealth not by what they possessed, but by what they could create and share. And though the colonies would one day be tangled in credit and coin, this era, this century of trade by honor, built the moral backbone that would define America long after money came. Because before fortunes were counted in numbers, they were counted in neighbors. And in that, the early settlers were richer than they knew. It began in whispers, not laws or edicts, but the quiet talk of men who had lived long enough to see what trust was worth. By the late 1600s, the colonies were no longer outposts. They were living towns, connected by dirt roads and human memory. Markets hummed, taverns filled, mills turned under the pull of water. Yet still, coins were rare and banks were rarer. What held the colonies together wasn't currency, it was character. If a man said, "I'll pay you come harvest," that promise was as binding as any signature. The worth of his word became the worth of his name. And over time, those names, the reliable ones, formed an invisible network of credit across the land. It wasn't printed. It wasn't measured in interest or percentage. It was measured in trust earned over years of honest work. In small towns from New England to the Carolinas, this unspoken system hardened into what people simply called a man's good standing. You could tell who had it by the way others greeted him at the meeting house door, or whether his tools were returned promptly. When a man in good standing borrowed a wagon or seed corn, nobody asked for collateral. His reputation was his collateral. A blacksmith named Jonathan Hale in 1693 kept a small forge outside Hartford. He'd built it with his father's tools, now worn smooth by decades of use. Neighbors came to him not just for iron but for fairness. Jonathan was known to charge less to widows and always made good on repairs. When his barn burned one winter, the entire town turned up the next morning. Carpenters, farmers, even the minister, rebuilding beam by beam without a word about payment. That's how the system worked. Honor was reciprocal. Help was not charity, it was settling the invisible debt of decency. By now, each settlement had men like Hale, anchors of trust whose names carried quiet weight. They were the backbone of this new American code. It wasn't written, but everyone could recite it. Keep your word, earn your bread, leave no man waiting. Break it and you'd feel the cold shoulder of a whole town. Keep it and doors opened without knocking. Children grew up watching their fathers trade with nothing but handshakes, learning that in America, your reputation arrived before you did. Even as trade expanded, ships arriving from England, merchants setting up shops, the old system held firm in the countryside. Coins clinked in coastal ports, but inland, deals were still struck in the language of trust and trade. A man's credit wasn't listed in ledgers, it was spoken in his absence. He's square, he always pays in good goods. He'll come through, he always does. That was the first credit rating in America, the testimony of neighbors. Over time, this ethic began to shape the nation's very character. Work was sacred. Dishonesty wasn't just a flaw, it was a kind of treason. A man might die poor, but if his name was clean, his sons inherited something greater than land. They inherited honor. And that idea that a man's worth was built, not borrowed, became the true founding principle of American life long before the Revolution. But change was coming. Ships brought more goods, more trade, more need for credit that could stretch beyond the reach of a handshake. Store ledgers began to appear, paper promises crept in, thin, fragile things that could vanish in a fire or a lie. The men of the old barter frontier didn't trust them. They'd seen how easily paper burned, but how hard it was to rebuild a reputation. Still, the world was shifting. And somewhere between the ink and the handshake, America's first moral economy began to blur. For a time, the code held strong. But whispers grew, of men trading faster than they could repay, of merchants who valued profit over pride. The same honor that had once been the colony's foundation was now being tested by the very success it had created. And out of that tension between work and wealth, between promise and paper, would rise the next chapter in the American story. The age of tools, trade, and transformation. The camera opens on a forge glowing in the dim light of dawn. Sparks leap like fireflies as a hammer meets iron. Each strike rings through the still air, the sound of America before it had a flag. By the early 1700s, the wilderness was turning into a world of workshops. The colonial craftsman, the blacksmith, the cooper, the wheelwright, the carpenter had become the backbone of every settlement from Maine to Carolina. They were not men of wealth, but of worth. Where others saw a raw and endless land, they saw potential measured in tools and time. A single forge could serve 100 families. A saw pit could turn a forest into a town. And every nail, hinge, and beam was a statement. We will endure. Coins were still scarce, credit was still personal, but tools were universal. They became the new frontier's most trusted medium of value. A hammer might be traded for a side of bacon. A barrel of nails could buy a horse. A well-made plow was worth more than a week's wages in London. The colonies were young, but their tools were ancient in purpose, to transform wilderness into civilization. And so every craftsman became not just a laborer, but a maker of freedom. Walk through a town in 1730 and you'd hear it, the thud of the adze, the whine of the plane, the steady rhythm of saw teeth on oak. Each sound told a story of progress, of barns raised, mills built, ships repaired. America was being forged not by money but by motion. And through that motion came pride, the quiet, grounded pride of men who knew that what they built would outlast them. A blacksmith named Robert Lattimore in Maryland was said to keep a small jar on his workbench, filled with the heads of broken nails. Each one, he'd say, is a reminder of a mistake that taught me something. That was the American education, learned in heat, dust, and repetition. Even the farms bore the mark of craft. Every tool from the scythe to the ox yoke was handmade, repaired and passed down. Families didn't just inherit land, they inherited skill. And that skill was the real measure of prosperity. A poor man with sharp tools and good hands was never truly poor. He could build, mend, and trade his way through any hardship. Skill was currency. And like gold, it had to be refined. This was the age when America's spirit took shape, the belief that a man's tools were extensions of his soul, and that labor itself was a kind of worship. In New England, shipwrights shaped hulls that could cross oceans. In Pennsylvania, iron workers poured the first cannon and plows from colonial furnaces. In the Carolinas, carpenters raised frame houses that still stand, their joints so tight that even centuries of rain couldn't pry them apart. Every craft had its guild of honor, not by title or membership, but by the standard a man set in his own shop. And across the colonies, that standard became a quiet competition, not for money, but for mastery. The taverns of the day weren't filled with idle talk of profit. They were filled with craftsmen comparing work. The clean line of a dovetail joint, the strength of a wagon axle, the polish of a rifle barrel. They weren't chasing wealth, they were chasing respect. And respect in those years was earned the only way that mattered, by doing something well. Yet even as hammers rang and saws sang, something else was stirring, a sense that this land was building toward more than survival. Each plank nailed, each wheel turned, each field cleared was part of a larger construction. A nation of makers. No king had ordered it. No bank had financed it. It rose from the ground by the sheer will of ordinary men who believed in work as destiny. And that belief gave them dignity, a quiet kind that couldn't be bought or sold. Still, the winds of change were gathering. Trade with Europe was increasing. Coins and credit notes began to circulate more freely. The language of commerce, interest, payment, debt, was creeping into the vocabulary of men who had never needed it before. Some saw opportunity, others saw danger. Because when money entered the equation, measure replaced meaning. The men who built with tools feared a new kind of builder was coming, one who would trade with ink instead of iron. But for now, for that half-century of honest work, America belonged to the craftsmen, the forgers, the builders. They shaped not only the land, but the nation's conscience. They taught their sons that work was not just a way to survive, it was a way to be worthy. And their echoes still ring in every barn beam, every plowshare, every stretch of iron rail that followed. Because before there was wealth, there was work. And before there were fortunes, there were tools in honest hands. The dawn breaks over the Allegheny ridges, a light spilling across forests so vast they seem endless. Mist curls over the pines, deer move like ghosts between trunks, and the sound of an axe echoes through the stillness. That sound, steady, deliberate, echoing into the wild, was the music of a rising nation. For by the mid-18th century, America's first true wealth had begun to reveal itself. It wasn't stored in vaults or counted in coin. It grew quietly in the soil. It walked through the woods. It flowed downriver on flatboats laden with timber, hides, and grain. This was the quiet wealth of the land, the fortune that didn't glitter but built everything that did. The settlers had learned by then that gold was a myth. The real treasure lay in resources that renewed themselves, trees that became ships, fields that became bread, rivers that became power. In Virginia and the Carolinas, white oak and longleaf pine were felled for ship masts and tar. In New York and Pennsylvania, grain fields rolled like golden seas, feeding not just colonies but trade routes across the Atlantic. In New England, wharves filled with barrels of whale oil and salted fish, the export that lit London's lamps and lined Europe's tables. Every plank, every barrel, every bushel was earned by calloused hands and honest sweat. But there was no single owner of this bounty. America's wealth was shared in labor. A farmer's wheat paid the miller, whose flour paid the wagon maker, whose wheels carried goods to port, where the shipwright earned his wage, often in barrels of that same flour. No one grew rich, yet all were sustained. It was a cycle that proved something profound, that a nation could thrive without the greed of kings or the weight of debt, so long as men respected the balance between work and the earth. In those years, the land was not yet exploited. It was partnered with. Farmers read the seasons like scripture. Loggers cut with restraint, knowing that the forest fed the town, and the town in turn would rebuild the forest with use. Nature was not a backdrop. It was the silent partner in every bargain. And though they didn't speak of it in lofty terms, these early builders understood something the modern world forgets, that prosperity is borrowed, not owned. Out on the frontier, trade moved at the speed of the river. Flatboats drifted south along the Ohio, stacked with barrels of flour, bundles of fur, and planks of maple. In the evenings, men pulled to the banks, tied off and cooked over fires, their entire fortunes rocking quietly in the current beside them. No banks, no brokers, just trust in the river and trust in the work that had brought them there. Back east, towns grew from that flow. Philadelphia's wharves lined with lumber from the Susquehanna. Boston's shipyards framed vessels from Maine pine. Charleston packed tar, rice, and indigo bound for Europe. But still behind every transaction stood a chain of human labor. Men who felled, milled, and packed by hand. Theirs was an economy of motion, not speculation. And in that motion, a national identity was forming. Steady, reliable, humble. Travelers from Europe often misunderstood it. They wrote of a rough, industrious people who toil without grace and speak little of profit. What they didn't see was the quiet pride beneath that simplicity. The deep satisfaction of men who could look upon their barns, their fields, their mills and know, this is mine because I made it. That pride could not be traded, taxed, or stolen. It was the moral currency of a people still untouched by finance, a belief that true wealth had to be earned through effort, not invention. But the age of quiet wealth was living on borrowed time. As the colonies prospered, British merchants began to see opportunity, raw materials that could feed an empire, labor that could be priced, and markets that could be controlled. Suddenly, paper contracts and royal tariffs appeared, weighing down a system that had once needed only handshakes. Men who had built their towns through labor now found themselves paying debts in pounds sterling to men they'd never met. The frontier was still barter-born, but the cities were learning the language of London, interest, import, and inequality. And in that tension between the honest wealth of the land and the artificial wealth of empire, the seeds of independence were sown. The farmers and craftsmen didn't yet call it revolution. They called it unfair trade. They felt it every time a ship loaded with their lumber sailed off to Britain and returned with debt instead of goods. So they did what their fathers had done before them. They relied again on each other. Barter revived, local trade deepened, and a silent defiance took root. A belief that if they could survive the wilderness without kings, they could survive prosperity without them too. In those years before the Revolution, America's wealth was measured not by the silver in its vaults, but by the strength of its harvest, the honesty of its men, and the abundance of its land. It was a wealth built slowly, quietly, the kind that grows deep roots and doesn't fear a storm. Because when the time came to fight for independence, these were the men who already knew how to stand on their own. The sky over the valley was low and gray, the kind that presses sound into silence. And then, a shout. Then another. Men gathered at dawn, boots heavy with mud, sleeves rolled, tools in hand. A barn raising. It began with one family, a roof lost to fire, a harvest at risk. Within a day, the whole township turned out. Axes swung, beams lifted, pegs hammered into green timber. There was no pay, no contract, no promise of reward. Just a shared belief that if one man stood, all men stood with him. That was the spirit of the Iron Pact, a bond forged not by wealth or law, but by need and respect. It built more than barns. It built America's first infrastructure. Barns, bridges, mills, and roads, one calloused hand at a time. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were thick with such cooperation. A new mill on the creek wasn't a private venture. It was a community undertaking. Each man cut timber, hauled stone, and shared in the flour it produced. The miller's toll was fair, just enough to keep the wheel turning. Roads between towns weren't built by governments, but by men with shovels and spirit, cutting paths through mud and rocks so wagons could pass before winter. This was the America of mutual obligation, where labor was both a duty and an honor. No bureaucracy, no treasury, only trust. In those gatherings, something deeper took root: brotherhood. A farmer might not own much, but when he lifted a beam beside his neighbor, he felt rich in a way no coin could capture. At sundown, the work paused. Bread was passed around, cider poured, and laughter rolled across the fields. This was how America learned to build together. It was rough, it was imperfect, but it worked. And it left behind something money never could: belonging. That same spirit carried into the Revolution. When the colonies rose against the crown, it wasn't only for taxes or trade. It was for the right to keep building by their own hands, without debt to kings or merchants. The same men who raised barns now raised forts and fought shoulder to shoulder. Their oath to one another, to stand firm, to pull equal weight, was the Iron Pact reborn in battle. After independence, the pact returned home. In the new republic, there were few banks, fewer coins, and no national currency worth trusting. So communities fell back on the only system that had ever worked: theirs. Farmers exchanged corn for horseshoes. Carpenters built doors for bushels of oats. Families swapped wool for salt, candles for grain, time for time. The nation survived its infancy on trust, trade, and toil, not treasury notes. In the Appalachian foothills, work frolics became tradition. Neighbors gathered to clear fields, build fences, or harvest crops too heavy for one family alone. The host offered food and music, the guests offered sweat and laughter. When the work was done, debts were settled not in coin, but in camaraderie. It was said, "A man who works alone builds a house. A man who works with his neighbors builds a town." That truth became the foundation of the American frontier ethic. Shared labor as shared destiny. Every plank and stone set by many hands carried a kind of sanctity. In small churches, benches were carved by the same men who prayed upon them. In gristmills, the grindstones bore the initials of every mason who laid them. It was craftsmanship mingled with community, a moral architecture. These weren't just structures, they were symbols of a people who believed that freedom meant responsibility, and that every able hand owed something back to the land that fed it. But beneath that unity, a shadow was growing. The new nation was expanding westward faster than ever. And with expansion came ambition. Land speculation, loans, profit. The Iron Pact, once built on brotherhood, began to strain under the weight of greed. Men who had once bartered freely now signed notes they couldn't repay. The first whispers of debt returned, like a sickness the frontier thought it had outlived. And though barns and mills still rose, the reasons for building were changing. Work, once sacred, was becoming a means to wealth, not worth. Yet in the backcountry, in the hills and small towns, the old ways endured a little longer. You could still find men trading labor for lumber, grain for iron, trust for trust. They didn't call it nostalgia. They called it living right. They believed a handshake was binding, that work measured a man, and that the only interest worth earning was the respect of one's peers. It was a world built on principle, not profit. And though history would soon drown it in industry and money, the echo of that pact never truly faded. You can still hear it in the creak of an old barn beam, in the worn grip of a family tool passed through generations. Because long before contracts and credit, America was held together by something stronger, a promise kept. The revolution had ended, the smoke had cleared, and the fields that once grew soldiers now grew wheat again. America stood, free but fragile, a nation of builders without a common purse. At first, that felt like freedom. Men bartered, traded, worked as they always had. But freedom, like the land, was vast, and soon ambition began to outgrow simplicity. The generation that had fought for independence now faced a new kind of war, the quiet war of debt. It began innocently. A merchant in Boston accepted British coins for lumber. A farmer in Pennsylvania took a small loan to buy seed. A craftsman in Virginia kept a store ledger, not out of greed, but to track the growing complexity of exchange. For the first time, Americans began to owe one another in writing. Paper promises, neat, formal, and dangerous, replaced the handshake. The drift had begun. The young republic needed roads, canals, schools, things too large for barter. So came the banks. The first chartered in Philadelphia in 1781, then others in New York, Baltimore, Charleston. They issued notes backed by gold few would ever see. Rectangles of trust that traveled faster than any man's reputation could follow. Money was no longer a thing you earned, it was a thing you could borrow. And that idea, subtle but seismic, changed the soul of a nation built on work. On the frontier, men watched this shift with wary eyes. They had seen how easily wealth could slip from calloused hands into inked ones. Still, the temptation was real. A man could now buy land before he'd worked it. He could own tools before he'd earned them. Progress, they called it. But to the old generation, the barn raisers, the mill builders, it looked like a debt disguised as destiny. In Tennessee, a farmer named Elias Harper wrote to his son in 1802, "In my youth we paid with labor, and the world seemed right. Now men sign papers and speak of interest. I fear they are building walls not of stone but of obligation." Across the new states, that fear spread. Store ledgers swelled, land speculation ran wild, and prices began to move faster than people could. The land itself, once a birthright of labor, became a commodity. The first great test came with the panic of 1819. Banks collapsed, credit froze, and men who had borrowed for land or tools found themselves ruined overnight. Foreclosures swept through the countryside like wildfire. Barns that once echoed with laughter now stood empty, padlocked by the same institutions that had promised prosperity. In taverns and meeting houses, men spoke bitterly. "We fought a king to be free of debt. Now we've crowned another made of paper." And yet, not all was lost. In the ruins of that first financial storm, the older ways flickered back to life. Communities revived barter, neighbors traded work for food, and pride returned to the only economy that never failed: human decency. In rural Ohio, a town called Zoar survived the panic untouched, its people living by common labor, no money among them. They tilled, built, and shared in equal measure, a living relic of the first American ethic: earn, don't owe. But beyond the hills, the tide could not be held back. Industry was coming, and with it, a new measure of worth that no longer fit in a man's calloused palm. By 1830, factories rose along the rivers. Mills spun cotton, forges poured iron, and the hum of commerce drowned the rhythm of the forge and plow. The handshake was still honored in towns and farms, but now it shared the stage with the signature, neat, efficient, and unfeeling. The men who once bartered for grain now checked ledgers, balances, and interest rates. The economy of faith was becoming the economy of figures. And yet, somewhere deep in the American heart, the memory of that older world, of work as virtue, of trust as currency, still smoldered like a coal that refused to die. Debt had crept into the bloodstream of the Republic, not as a villain, but as a convenience. It promised speed. It delivered dependency. And by the time most realized what had been traded away, it was too late to go back. The new America was being built not by the rhythm of hammers, but by the quiet scratching of pens. And the men who still believed in honest work could feel the ground shifting beneath their boots. The drift was complete, but not everyone would surrender to it. Out in the farthest reaches, among the ranchers, the craftsmen, the stubborn keepers of the old code, there were still those who refused to let numbers define them. They called themselves nothing at all. But history would remember them as the last generation of debtless men. The door creaks open, and a bell rings above it. Dust hangs in the air. Sunlight slants across barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, and jars of nails. Behind the counter stands a man with spectacles, ink-stained fingers, and a heavy book, the ledger. For most of rural America, this was now the center of the world. Not the courthouse, not the church, the general store. Here, a man could trade, borrow, and for the first time quietly fall into debt. The storekeeper knew every name in town. He sold by trust, not coin, scribbling promises in neat lines of ink. To Mr. Thompson, 3 pounds coffee, 2 bolts canvas, paid when crop comes in. To Mrs. Avery, 1 spool thread, settled next month. No one called it credit, they called it accommodation. And in that small word lay the slow redefinition of honor itself. Where once a man's word was his payment, now it was his collateral. The difference was small, but deadly. By the 1830s, this pattern stretched from Maine to Missouri. A good harvest might clear the year's debts. A bad one chained a man to his ledger for life. The general store became both blessing and burden, a place where community and dependency lived side by side. A man could feed his family on borrowed goods, but each signature felt heavier than the last. He worked harder, not freer. As one Iowa farmer wrote in 1848, "Each season I begin already owing the next. The store ledger has replaced my shovel as master." For the storekeeper, too, the new system was double-edged. He wasn't a banker, but he became one by necessity. His success depended on others' honesty, a delicate balance between compassion and caution. Too much mercy, and he'd go broke. Too little, and he'd lose the trust that held the town together. So he read men like weather by their eyes, their hands, the tone of their promise. In a way, the old code of reputation still survived here, hidden between the lines of the ledger. But it was fading, page by page. The railroad accelerated everything. Goods arrived faster, wider, richer, and with them came catalogs, cash prices, and distant creditors who never saw the sweat behind the sale. Storekeepers borrowed from wholesalers. Wholesalers borrowed from banks. And suddenly, the same towns that once lived by barter now owed men they'd never met. The chain of debt stretched across the continent like a telegraph wire, humming with invisible control. Work no longer ended the day's obligation. It merely delayed it. The nation that once measured worth by effort was now measuring it by payment schedule. In the South and Midwest, after the Civil War, a harsher form of this system took root, the crop lien. Farmers, stripped by conflict and scarcity, borrowed against the next season's harvest. Merchants extended credit for seed, tools, and supplies. Interest wrapped around hope like a noose. When the crops came, the debts always came first. Families lived, worked, and died inside ledgers that never closed. Freedom, once hard-earned, had become conditional. A man could own land and still not own his life. But not all bowed to it. In the hills of Kentucky and Tennessee, in the far ranches of Texas and the Dakotas, the old ways held on: barter, neighbor trade, and pride. A man might swap beef for tools or work a day in exchange for a wagon wheel. The paper economy came slow to those who still believed in the handshake economy, where decency was binding and trust was tender enough to spend. These men were fewer each year, but they carried something pure, a living memory of the age before numbers ruled the heart. By mid-century, American life had split down the middle. In cities, banks, credit, speculation. In the countryside, labor, trade, honor. The same country that had once been united by work was now divided by how it measured it. And though industry would soon dominate, there remained a stubborn dignity in the small towns and farmsteads that refused to surrender their old code. They lived leaner, but freer. Poorer perhaps, but unowned. In one Ohio town, a blacksmith named Thomas Bell refused to open a ledger. He charged in trade, shoes repaired for sacks of wheat, hinges forged for cords of wood. People called him old-fashioned. He called it fair dealing. When he died in 1869, the preacher at his funeral said, "He left no money behind, but not a soul could say he owed them a cent." That was legacy enough. By 1870, the store ledger had become as common as the plow, a tool of necessity and a symbol of surrender. Yet even as America moved deeper into its age of credit, the memory of that older balance where worth was earned, not borrowed, lingered like the scent of sawdust and sweat in a closed-up shop. For every man who signed his name in ink, there was another who looked at the pen and remembered the handshake. And for a moment he could almost feel the weight of what had been lost. The wind that once carried the sound of hammers now carried silence. Storefronts shuttered, wagons sat idle, fields unplanted. Across the young nation, from New York's cobblestones to the red clay of Georgia, the first great collapse of paper America had come. It was called the Panic of 1837, and it began, as such things always do, with confidence, the easy kind that comes from forgetting what labor once cost. For years, the country had been drunk on growth. Banks multiplied, loans poured into land, and speculation ran like fever. Paper money, printed by local banks and backed by little more than faith, fluttered through every town. You could buy land you'd never seen, pay with a promise you couldn't keep, and borrow against a future that hadn't yet arrived. The America that once built barns by hand now built fortunes with ink. And then the ink turned cold. In May of 1837, the banks began to fail. Silver dried up, credit froze. Merchants who'd traded on borrowed faith watched their ledgers turn to ashes overnight. Farmers who had mortgaged their land to buy seed found themselves dispossessed by the very institutions that had promised prosperity. One newspaper wrote, "Men who yesterday were worth thousands wake today in ruin, wondering what of it was ever real." It wasn't the first reckoning, but it was the first to reveal the truth that would haunt America forever. When money collapses, only work remains. In the countryside, barter returned out of sheer necessity. A farmer might trade corn for boots, leather for salt. In towns, shopkeepers tore pages from ledgers, burned them in the stove, and started over. There was bitterness, but also a strange clarity, a remembering of how things had been before credit. Some said the panic was punishment, others said it was correction. Either way, it reminded a proud people that paper is weak where muscle is strong. But the lesson didn't hold. Within decades, the fever returned. By the 1850s, railroads cut through the heartland like veins of ambition. Stocks replaced land deeds, profit replaced purpose. The same men who once forged their lives in iron now bought pieces of companies they'd never see. America was learning a new language, speculation, and it spoke fluently of risk disguised as hope. Then came 1873. Another panic. Another collapse. Banks folded, railroads halted, wages vanished. The streets of New York filled with men once called successful, now standing in bread lines. Out west, mills went silent, mines closed. And in small towns, the old-timers shook their heads, saying, "The land never lies, only the men who trade it do." It wasn't just money that failed, it was faith. Faith in a system that had replaced effort with arithmetic. For the men of labor, the cost was brutal. They hadn't gambled, but they paid the debt all the same. Their savings, their work, their trust, all swept away by promises printed too easily and honored too late. In the blacksmith shop, the fire still burned. On the farms, hands still tilled. But they worked now with a bitterness that hadn't been there before, The knowledge that sweat no longer guaranteed survival. They'd done everything right, and it hadn't mattered. A farmer in Illinois wrote in his journal in 1874, "When I was a boy, a day's work brought a day's worth. Now a man may labor a year and owe more than when he began." They've turned the sweat of the brow into a gamble. He wasn't wrong. The very fabric of American worth had changed, from tangible to theoretical, from earned to owed. And yet, in that ruin, a kind of defiance was born. Across the heartland, groups like the Grange began to rise, farmers banding together to fight the machinery of credit, to return dignity to the work of hands. They built co-ops, shared grain, cut out middlemen. They were in spirit the grandsons of the men who'd built the first barns, men who believed that prosperity should be grown, not lent. The panics came and went like storms. Each left behind the same debris, broken promises, scattered fortunes, and a quiet yearning for the steadiness of simpler days. And through it all, a question lingered in the American conscience. Had freedom, the kind bought with sweat and courage, been traded for convenience? Some said yes. Others just went back to work, believing that as long as they kept building, they could keep the nation honest, even if the bankers could not. By century's end, the pattern was clear. Paper would rise, paper would fall, and labor would always be left to clean the wreckage. But in barns and workshops, where the smell of sawdust and iron still lingered, men held fast to a quieter truth. A nation built on work can bend under debt, but it never breaks. Steel rails gleamed in the sun where once there had been nothing but dirt and dust. America had entered its age of industry. The train whistle echoed across the plains, long, mournful, and proud. But out beyond the smoke, far from the reach of banks and factories, there still lived men of the old creed, the last who measured wealth in calluses, not currency. You'd find them in the high plains of Montana, the red hills of Texas, the pine woods of Arkansas. They rose before dawn, worked until the light died, and slept in the comfort of exhaustion, that old, honest sleep that money can't buy. They traded in goods, not guarantees. Beef for grain, timber for tools, horses for leather. Ranchers, smiths, homesteaders, teamsters, the keepers of the older America, who believed that debt was a disease and labor the only cure. On the Wyoming frontier, a rancher named Samuel Rusk was known to say, "A man should owe no more than his next sunrise." A man's handshake still settled a deal, and a broken word could still get you exiled faster than a gunfight. There were no ledgers, only memory. Each day was a fresh balance sheet. What you built, fixed, or grew was your profit. What you wasted, your loss. He meant it literally. In that simplicity, these men found a kind of peace the cities had forgotten. The blacksmith shop was still the town's heartbeat. No contracts, only reputation. You could hear the ring of the hammer clear across the valley. One strike for living, another for meaning. He might never own a banknote, but he'd mend a wagon wheel that could cross a continent. His work carried permanence, proof that craft still had honor in an age obsessed with speed. Down in Texas, the cowhands drove herds north to the railheads, sleeping under stars and rain, paid not in gold but in beef and respect. Because his hands, blackened with soot and sweat, represented something the machine could not replace: trust. And though the railroads brought in goods faster and cheaper, people still came to him. A man's wage was the herd he tended, the saddle he mended, the boots on his feet. And if you asked him what he was worth, he'd point to the horizon and say, "They called it settling in kind. Everything I can ride across and back before sundown." It wasn't bravado, it was arithmetic of the old world, measured in sweat and dust. These men didn't reject progress out of stubbornness. They'd seen too many neighbors fall to the promise of easy credit, men who built fine homes on borrowed coin and lost them to the first drought. They'd learned the old truth: what isn't earned can't be kept. They simply knew its cost. By the 1890s, they were a minority in their own land. Factories filled the cities. Wages replaced barter. And so they worked harder, lived leaner, and held their pride the way a blacksmith holds iron in tongs, knowing it softens if not struck daily. But in the rural corners, the ethos endured. In Kansas, a man might still trade fence work for a team of mules. The word laborer no longer meant an independent craftsman. It meant a man on someone else's clock. The system wasn't written, but it was alive, a ghost of the old barter world still whispering beneath the noise of industry. In Montana, a neighbor might lend lumber, knowing he'd get help come harvest. Writers of the day called them anachronisms, the stubborn breed. That before there was profit, there was purpose. Reminders that before America became an economy, it had been a brotherhood. But they weren't relics, they were reminders. They didn't scorn the new world, they simply chose not to owe it anything. Their tools were few but clean. Their barns stood plain but strong. A story was told in Colorado of an old rancher named Will Timmons. When a banker rode out to offer him a loan for expansion, Will wiped his hands on his trousers and said, "And their word, though it no longer carried through banks or markets, still carried through towns where it mattered most. If I can't lift it myself, I don't deserve to own it. Son, my father built everything we ever had with his back, not his signature." The banker left confused. But Will's fence still stands. The next generation would measure life by the clock, not the sun. By wages, not work. By the dawn of the 20th century, these last honest hands were fading. They didn't chase success. They built it, plank by plank, trade by trade. Yet their legacy ran deeper than they knew. Because they had proven, through hardship and humility, that a man didn't need wealth to live well, only worth. And though they never called themselves heroes, the America they left behind still rests on what they believed. That the measure of a man isn't what he owns, but what he builds with his own two hands. The camera moves slowly now. Across an empty barn at sunrise, dust drifts through shafts of light. The boards creak, old but steady, cut by men who have been gone a century, their names forgotten, their work still holding against time. This is where it ends. And perhaps where it truly began. Every beam, every plank, every rusted nail still whispers of that first covenant, the one written not in ink but in effort. A language older than money, older than government, the language of work. Before profit, before credit, before the machinery of wealth, there was this simple truth. A man's value was the sum of what he gave to the world, not what he could take from it. You can still feel it in places untouched by hurry. An old homestead in Nebraska, a millstone in Vermont, a stretch of fence in Wyoming that no wind has managed to push down. Each one stands as evidence that the real America wasn't built in boardrooms or banks. It was raised out of the ground by men who believed that work was sacred. They didn't call themselves patriots. They didn't speak of legacy. They just kept at it, plowing, forging, building, repairing, making a life where none had existed the day before. And in their silence, they left behind the one thing that wealth could never buy: honor. They knew the sound of an honest day, the thud of a shovel in dirt, the hiss of iron in water, the crack of timber splitting clean. And when evening came, they'd rest with the comfort of knowing they owed nothing to anyone. Their accounts were balanced in sweat. Time has turned their labor into nostalgia. We drive past their barns without seeing them, cross their bridges without remembering who set the first stone. We live in the shade of their work, the warmth of their faith, the comfort of their order. They built things that lasted because they built them to matter. And though their names have vanished from the ledgers of history, their handwriting is still everywhere, carved into the grain of every farmhouse door, hidden in the joinery of every beam that still fits true. That is the wealth they left us: durability. It's easy to forget that before America was rich, it was resourceful. Before it was modern, it was moral. And before it learned to lend, it learned to labor. The first settlers who carved a clearing out of wilderness. The tradesmen who forged iron without heat enough to spare. The neighbors who raised barns without counting hours. They were not perfect men, but they were authentic ones. Their work was slow, often rough, but it endured because it was honest. And honesty, they believed, was the first ingredient of anything worth building. The land remembers them. It remembers the sound of their axes, the rhythm of their plows, the courage in their quiet. It remembers that every acre of this country was once measured not by price, but by effort. And if you listen closely, when the wind moves through an old barn's rafters or the river runs over the stones they once stood on, you can almost hear them again. The steady pulse of labor, the humble pride of men who built a nation without money and without regret. Their legacy isn't written in monuments. It's written in motion, in the endurance of what they made and the dignity they gave to the making of it. We live in a faster, louder, wealthier America now. But every bridge we cross, every field we harvest, every nail we drive into wood, we are walking in their footsteps, whether we know it or not. And when the day ends and the light fades over the land they left behind, we might still whisper the truth they lived by. They didn't build it perfect, but they built it honest. If this story reminded you of the true worth of honest work and the men who built this nation by hand, give it a like and subscribe. Every click helps keep alive the voices of those who built America, not with money, but with sweat and pride.